In the previous video, we discussed how raising capital and cash burn are two sides of the same coin. If a startup raises capital, it must have subsequent cash burn. It cannot remain cash positive after raising capital because that would mean that the capital it raised would remain idle in its bank account. Here's how all this looks on a graph of the startup's financial projection. When a startup pitches to a VC for raising money, it usually makes a financial projection for the future. This is what almost all such projections look like. On the y-axis is the projected cash burn of the startup, and on the x-axis is time in months. Focus on the orange curve. Currently, in month 1, before it has raised capital, the startup is cash positive. It is not burning cash right now. Instead, the startup is currently generating excess cash of $220,000 per month. However, from month 2 onward, the startup plans to hire people and increase marketing, etc. So its expenses would increase, so it would start burning cash and would continue doing so till it reaches break even in month 13. And by month 30, the startup expects to be massively cash positive and generate $9.5 million in excess cash every month. Okay, so if the startup plans to increase its expenses and start burning cash, how will it survive this period of cash burn? Well, that's why the startup is pitching for VC investment. It will raise capital to fund its cash burn between month 2 and month 13. And how much capital does it need to raise? That would be the sum of its planned monthly cash burns from month 2 to month 13. If you are good at math, you know that this sum is represented in a graph like this by the area under the curve. I have highlighted this area with slanting orange lines. In this example, this area comes out to be $4.6 million. So the startup would pitch to raise this much VC money to enable it to execute this financial projection. A typical VC round of this size would usually be called a Series A. Now, suppose that the startup succeeds in raising its Series A and executes flawlessly on its financial projection, which starts to attract more VCs. And with more VC attention, suppose the startup decides in month 10 that it should raise even more capital to grow even faster. A VC round in such a case would usually be called a Series B. So when the startup pitches for a Series B in month 10, what would its updated financial projection look like? This is what the new projection would look like. The startup would once again plan to increase its cash burn as it ramps up expenses in an attempt to grow future cash flows even faster. So that now, in the new plan, by month 30, the startup would be even more cash positive and generate $19.5 million in excess cash every month, compared to the old plan in which it would have generated $9.5 million. Once again, the amount of capital the startup would need to raise in Series B to execute on the new plan would be the area under the new curve, which in our example is $7.7 million. Notice that raising its Series B will push the break-even point for the startup further. In the old plan, the startup would have broken even in month 13, while in the new plan, it would break even in month 18. You should be able to see by now that this is always going to be true. Every time a startup raises capital, it will plan to burn that money and push its break-even point further up. Otherwise, why would you raise capital if you are not going to change your cash burn plan? If you do not change your cash burn plan, then any additional capital you raise will just sit idle in a bank. Many of my MBA students express this misconception that startups burn too much VC money and continuously need more VC money to survive, or that cash burning startups keep raising more cash and keep burning more cash with no end in sight, and they worry that this must be unsustainable. Try to address these misconceptions with this cash burn projection framework that we just discussed. Can you see how a startup that keeps executing well and attracting capital to fund even more ambitious plans will always keep pushing its break-even point further and keep burning cash? As long as the startup can attract capital and has growth opportunities available to deploy that capital, it will keep raising capital, which mathematically implies that it will keep burning cash. The reality is that startups plan expense and investment. If capital is available, you will raise capital and use it for growth, which will make you cash negative. But if capital is not available, you will spend less and become cash positive. Ignoring the effect of accrual terms, this means that you will report a profit when you cannot raise capital to fund your losses. So here's the takeaway. Making a profit is a choice because expense is a choice. If you raise capital, you will increase expenses and make losses. If you don't raise capital, you will not increase expenses and will report a profit. Let's see this in action in the real-world example of Tesla. The blue bars in this graph represent Tesla's net fund raise in a year. The orange bars represent Tesla's cash burn in a year. Note how neatly the blue and the orange bars align. Every time Tesla raises capital, its cash burn increases. And every time it does not raise capital, its cash burn decreases, like it last happened in 2018. It should be obvious by now. If Tesla can raise capital, it can deploy that capital to open new factories and so forth, which will be accounted as cash burn. If Tesla cannot raise capital for any reason, it must postpone its plans to open new factories, which will reduce Tesla's cash burn. So it should also be obvious by now that profit and loss are choices because expense and investment are choices that can be postponed or scrapped depending on the availability of capital. But if loss is mathematically just an obvious consequence of raising capital, why is there so much anxiety in the media about startups making losses? Because journalists do not understand this simple fact that raising capital must always lead to subsequent cash burn, and the amount of capital raised will be approximately equal to the amount of cash burn in the future. They celebrate when a startup raises money. Here's TechCrunch celebrating Deliveroo's fundraise in November 2017. And then they complain when the same startup reports subsequent losses. Here's The Guardian lamenting Deliveroo's increased losses 1 year later in October 2018. And here's Bloomberg lamenting Deliveroo's losses another year later in October 2019. I hope some journalists watch this video and figure out that any capital raise will always lead to subsequent losses unless the startup is willing to keep the raised capital idle in a bank account. Another thing that bothers me about the media's narrative about profit and loss is that I don't understand why journalists seem to be so enamored with the idea of profit when they are reporting about young startups. Profit is not remarkable. Profit is commonplace. Almost all businesses in the world make a profit. Every single small business that you have ever interacted with in your life makes a profit. Every taxi cab operator makes a profit. Every restaurant makes a profit. Every florist, gas pump, grocery shop, and garage makes a profit. Do you know how I know this? Because they would not exist if they did not make a profit. Let me rephrase so I'm more exact. Survival profit is commonplace. All small businesses that you interact with usually operate in perfect competition and make survival profits, which implies that the return on their investment is similar to the interest offered by the fixed deposit of a large bank. But abnormal profit is rare and remarkable, which is why losses are remarkable. Because if someone is making persistent losses, it means that someone else is providing them capital to cover those losses. And capital is seldom foolish. Capital seeks return. So if someone is making persistent losses, it is probably because they are operating in an environment where capital is chasing the slim possibility of abnormal profit. Here are some more misconceptions about the idea of loss that I have encountered in my MBA class. Funds are raised to expand and invest and not to make losses. But any expansion or investment is reported by accountants as cash burn. VC money is not just for burning. But there are only two options. Use the VC money or let it sit idle in a bank. and any use of VC money is reported by accountants as cash burn. An entrepreneur gets funds to manage his business better and to make profits from day one. If you make profits from day one, whatever funds that you raised will sit idle in a bank account. If you show profits early on, VCs won't invest. This is simply not true. In my pre-class survey for MBA students, I asked these two questions. If you are watching this video as part of the venture capital and entrepreneurship specialization on the website of Relentless VC, you too would have filled out such a survey. The first question asks, if you were to start a startup, would you raise venture capital? Usually 90% of my class answers yes. What was your answer? The second question asks, if you are comfortable with the idea of startups burning cash. More than half my class usually responds that they are not comfortable with cash burn. Again, what was your answer? It should be clear to you by now that if you have answered yes to the first question and no to the second question, then what you believe is a paradox. You are not alone. More than half of my class believes in this paradox before they start this specialization. But I am hopeful that by now you will have assimilated the fact that fundraise and cash burn are two sides of the same coin. In the next video, let's conclude our Type A and Type B thought experiment. Hey there, I'm KJ Saxena, founder of Relentless VC. The video you just watched is part of the Venture Capital and Entrepreneurship specialization, which is available absolutely for free on relentless.ventures. Go check it out. If you're a tech startup founder and want to raise money from us, you should apply on our website. Lastly, if you like this video, do subscribe and share it with your friends.